get going. All right. Welcome, everyone. We have not done this before, but thanks to Infinity Athletics and Dave Diggin, a strength and conditioning professor at Diggin College, who I have seen twice a week for 3 years. And you can tell that I have not bulked up. So it's not going to happen. But basically, strength training is one of the most important things. And we're learning that more and more as we go. Those who have been running for many years didn't used to do that or think about it in any way, shape, or form, and avoided weight rooms like the plague until you start learning that older is the only way to the age of you start gaining muscle. So Dave's gonna give us some whole lot of information about like why strength training is good and dispel some of the myths like bulking up. And then I believe we're going to get a little more from Joey and the Infinity Athletics staff on sort of what they're offering. Basically, this clinic is meant to be just like getting everyone the same. If you wish to continue and do that, Infinity is working up. They've got a big discount for FLRC users, runners. It'll be a training program designed for runners. So obviously, there's a ton of things you could do with weights. If you want to bulk up, you can. It's very different training, and so their training is designed for runners. And then you could either just do the app, or you can come in here and do twice a week training with their gear and the people. So without further ado, Dave, thank you so much. We also have some folks coming in via Zoom, and we'll try to get their questions at the end. Dave, you just let people know if you want questions during or after.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Adam. I really appreciate the Finger Lakes Running Club for inviting me along. I've known Adam, I want to say, since about 2017 or 2018, when he participated in a research project of mine. Probably should say that out loud. We've been working together for about 3 years continuously in terms of the strength work. And so really, we've been talking about doing this back and forth for a while. So this is like the first opportunity. It's great. I really appreciate the folks doing that for us, and also Joey and the Infinity team as well for hosting the session. So hopefully you folks will get a lot out of it. And just to kind of introduce myself, obviously I have a weird accent. I come from Ireland, and so hopefully by the end, I'm sick of the accent at least. We'll see. But I've been a professor at Ithaca College teaching strength and conditioning for about 10 years now. Program director for strength and conditioning concentration that we offer to the undergraduate exercise. Well, my interest in strength training and how it impacts distance running performance was so as a kid, I was very active. I was playing lots of soccer. That was like my primary sport. I was also doing martial arts. And around, I was about 16, 17, and my martial arts instructor introduced me to strength training. And one of the things that I started to notice was pretty quickly, I started to get strong. Pretty quickly, actually, it started to improve my performance in other areas. And so I was always curious about like why, understand what's going on in the body, how's this impacting me. And so I decided to do an exercise science undergraduate course. And as part of that course, we had what we called the final year project. It was like a research thesis that we had to do in our senior year. And my idea was, okay, I want to do an intervention study with distance runners. I want to try and get a sense of how strength training impacts distance running performance. And so I started that project. Unfortunately, we were only able to recruit 7 runners, so it wasn't publication worthy, but I had a lot of fun with it. And I then decided to kind of move on and do a PhD in a very similar area. So I got my PhD in biomechanics from the University of Limerick. And for about 3 years now, I've been working pretty consistently with a group of distance runners. So we have a group of 8 runners that's coming to us about twice a week to, again, try to develop their strength, try and improve. So that kind of in a nutshell is part of my experience and what I'm bringing to the session, if that makes sense. In relation to the topic, or how we'll kind of move through the topic today, I'm really curious to get a sense of what your resistance training experience is so far, as well as maybe what some of your specific beliefs are around this area. So I'm going to ask some questions about that. I'm kind of curious about how you feel resistance training has really benefited you up until this point, for those that have done it, in addition to any apprehensions that you might have about it or how to get started. So just sort of curious about where you're coming from. From there, because I am a scientist, we're going to get into a little bit of science. We're going to try to keep it sort of simple to an extent where we're going to look at what the research says from the performance versus the injury standpoint. And I think from the injury standpoint, we've got some very interesting discussions that we might actually get into. Okay. And then the last part, some recommendations based on the research. What are some recommendations in terms of like how we might move forward, how we might get started, and of course the program that the folks at Infinity are going to work on will really better. Okay. Any questions? No. Pace is okay. Yes. Very good. So resistance training is basically any exercise where the movement is performed against some sort of external load. So it could be, I guess, using free weights. It could also be using like elastic resistance, like bands. It could even be using body weight exercises because you're resisting gravity. So that's really what we're talking about. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. Any other questions? No, we're good, great. And so that brings us on to the first piece where I'm curious about your experience. And so could I have a show of hands of, let's say, the runners in the room that are, let's say, resistance training consistently? Okay, so we're talking about maybe half. Okay, along that line, is anybody willing to kind of share some of their experience, thinking a little bit about how long have you been doing it? How frequently have you been doing it? What intensities have you been working at? And that's very important. Okay. How long do your sessions last? What types of exercises have you been doing? And have you been resistance training under the guidance of a trainer? So those are some of the things that I'm sort of curious about answering right now. So Mike's going to, my lovely assistant right over here, jot down some key points about that. Okay. So who's willing to share? So how long have you been doing it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that would be okay. Speak right now. Okay. So what I'm sort of hearing within that is like it's a range of exercise. High intensity work, it kind of seems like in terms of, and when I say high intensity, I want to rise like body intensity, where your heart rate is probably pretty. Okay. Anything else? Not so much. So far we're kind of saying like what, 3 times a week over here. Yeah, Adam.
Oh, go.
Yeah.
So I've been training for about years. We started in, I think, October 20.
Mhm.
Mondays and Thursdays, but twice a week, exactly. Actually, and understanding from talking to Dave, research is that twice a week is what you need to be able to improve. Once a week will get you maintenance, and twice or 3 times a week. Right. Intensities are not very. There's no cardio stuff involved. So the only time I ever, feet elevated, playing on that ball for minutes, swearing a day. So,
Which is often.
stir the pots. Stir the pots. So, but that said, intensity in terms of something which is slightly lower intensity and higher versus some that are heavy looks. And honestly, I think I prefer that. And it's just more fun that goes faster. And doing 15 squats on something.
Yeah, that's tough.
So sessions are basically an hour, and we have seven exercises that move from so single stuff that's really important to get doing this. Moving on to a lot of squats, hamstring stuff, and then big was stuff. And particularly when you get into the weighted stuff, they just constantly tell us you need to get the chest up, form work. And it felt a couple, like doing it slightly wrong, and that get that sense of ooh, yeah. So,
Thanks, Adam. I'm curious, how many of us are doing strength training on our own? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 8, 10. Okay, so 10. And so how many of us are doing strength training under the guidance of the profession? 6. Yeah, okay, so it's sort of both. So 7-ish. Okay, so 7 out of the group doing that there. Who is not doing it at all? So awesome. So that's sort of like what we're trying to get to the bottom of here in terms of like, okay, what's our experience? Where are we going with this? And so from here, for those of you that have strength trained, do you feel it's benefited you? And if so, how? So yeah. So there's like a movement awareness piece that's actually happening with you in terms of like your strength training. Great. Yeah. Muscles that are working now, yeah. And so, you know, in relation to this, we've kind of got like the idea of like performance versus injury. So a number of you so far have mentioned the impact of resistance training on to injury, right? But what about in relation to performance? Is there anybody that has been strength training that feels like actually it's benefit my performance? Yeah, absolutely. In what way?
It's an improvement.
Springness. Yeah, it's an impact.
And it,
It's like huge. Okay, great. And so next question, what are your apprehensions for those of you who are maybe thinking about getting started, or for those of you who maybe are working with a trainer, why do you work with a trainer? Like, what are some apprehensions that you have about including strength training? Great.
so I said that I don't do.
Shame on you.
So,
Okay.
but then.
Yeah.
So I kind of. Want to be able to.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of difficult balancing doctors and like taking. What I see online, it's all the stuff my doctor.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly like the case. We often run into trouble with strength training plans if flexibility work isn't being done
Right.
alongside that. And then athletes start to get stiffer, right? And as a result of that stiffness, they get soft tissue. So again, there's, I guess, a misconception about like what is an appropriate design plan. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just recently started routine, but really struggling with like it's
Yeah,
like this
yeah.
last week I did like a focus kind of day on Tuesday, and then I did speed work on Wednesday. It's like what the hell? So I really am like, how am I gonna get all the miles I need and also fit in strength?
Yeah.
Like not be so sore that I like can't handle it
Yeah.
and still have good form when I'm strength
Yeah.
training. So I'm basically just struggling with like, where do I fit?
Yeah, and so we'll touch on that later when we kind of look at some recommendations. But one of the key aspects on that as well is like your timing, right? How are you timing that? The other disclaimer to mention is we know that through strength training, we will get sore, but we won't always be sore. And that's important to be aware of, right? So, you might say
Over
again.
time, like won't be less sore after.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes, at least in my own personal experience, and maybe Adam chime into that as well if he feels like it, but oftentimes it's like in the initial stage of getting started, you start to feel, oh, geez, my legs are hurting, every part of your body is hurting. But then once you sort of get through that, then the resistance training stimulus doesn't have a tendency to cause that soreness as much anymore.
It's like getting back into
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
it.
Yeah,
So-
call it delayed onset muscle soreness.
Yeah, the DOMS, so what I've experienced is it was more at the beginning. Starting to block every 4 weeks, and that's what the first session is always just learning how to do the exercises. It tends to be fairly easy. The next one, where we're actually doing the full thing and doing all the exercises, and when many of them are new, that's when I'll be sore for the next 2 days. And it's actually not even usually the next 2 days, it's usually the second. Like the next day is not too bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not terrible. It's just it was a new set of exercises. And sometimes the session, sometimes, and then by the fourth, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's gone. Yeah.
So, but it is very much, you got to get your muscles ready.
Yes.
They're just, it's like, in shock the
Yeah.
first time you made them do something like designed for this. Yeah.
Awesome. And so now that we've sort of gotten a sense of like where folks are coming from, what I'd like to do now is really talk a little bit about the science behind resistance training and how it actually impacts performance. I'm going to address performance first because in my experience of working with distance runners, oftentimes the first thing that they go to is injury prevention. Okay. They never go to performance. And so there's always that sort of tug of war between like performance, injury prevention, and what runners' experiences are around this area. So I want to address performance first because the research in the performance area is very, very interesting. And a quick shout out to my former housemate, Chris Beatty, who's done actually a lot of work in this area. And if you're into scientific papers, you may have seen some of his work. But the first research on looking into how resistance training affects distance running performance was actually back in 1980. And there's been, not quite a steady stream of articles coming out since then. It kind of peaked in the 80s and then dipped again in the 90s and then slowly started to come back up then in the 2000s. And so Chris's paper actually looked at, it was like a review study that was looking at, right, well, what is the majority of the research saying in this specific area about how does resistance training affect distance running performance? And so he was able to find a bunch of different articles. He looked at 8 articles looking at how it affected runners, and 9 articles looking at how it affected cycling performance, 6 for cross-country skiing, and 3 for triathlon. Okay. In relation to the duration of the interventions here, you can see they sort of varied 5 to 25 weeks. So 5-week periods, that's a very short period of time. Okay. And actually in the first 6 weeks of a strength training plan, your strength will increase quite quickly. And that's neuromuscular in nature. So it's not that surprising that we might actually start to get benefits from strength training as a result of only a 5-week training period. Okay. But most of us need to think a bit more long-term, right? And so again, we're looking at maybe the longest study was 25 weeks. And again, if we're putting that in the context of like how most runners train, most runners are sort of like looking at periods of time that are longer than maybe we're thinking about a year-long period, okay? Chris actually did a follow-up to this, and we'll look at that, where actually his periodized plan was over 40 weeks. So quite a long time. But in terms of like the different content of the resistance training programs, you had upper and lower body compound exercises. So compound exercises are exercises like the squat, like the deadlift, the bench press, where you're thinking about large muscle groups, multiple joint actions. So we're performing those movements against resistance, right? Our upper lower body, actually the majority of the research focuses more on the lower body and the impact of lower body strength training. But also some isolation exercises there. So they were using, in some cases, machines. So even just doing like leg extension, leg pulls, right? And then plyometrics. And plyometrics is sort of like the interesting one. Like you can get really good benefits from plyometrics after only 6 weeks of training. So it can be quite effective. Couple of things to sort of bear in mind is what are some key variables that it's worth looking at. Most of you folks as runners will have heard of every one of these. So a lot of the studies looked at, okay, strength. Well, it's a resistance training program, so it should benefit strength, right? The other thing is time trial performance. Oftentimes runners are interested in, yeah, okay, maybe my VO2 max changes, but does it actually affect my performance? And so he looked at some studies that also included effects on time trial performance. VO2 max, right? We're all familiar with VO2 max. I don't need to explain that, right? And so VO2 max was also looked at here by the majority of the studies. Lactate threshold, running economy, okay? So those were like the key variables, the key performance variables. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I do. So generally within our programming, we'll lean towards the multi-joint exercises because they're a little bit more sport specific. They involve a lot of like movement demands, movement coordination, all of those sorts of things, right? The isolation exercises are also quite useful for certain muscles that, let's say, runners might have issues with. So let's say shin splints. We're probably all familiar with shin splints, right? Well, doing an isolation exercise to enhance the strength of the tibialis anterior is found to be very effective at reducing the symptoms of shin splints, right, and recovering from that. So in that scenario, an isolation exercise is perfect. But it's almost like within a session or within a program, you start global where you're thinking big joints or multi-joint actions, big muscles. And then as you move through your session, you kind of start to get into more isolation. So in answer to your question, it's like both, right? I wouldn't say, oh yeah, don't do isolation exercises. They are useful at times, right?
The other thing that I've experienced a lot, I've been injured for much of this time. Things that completely unrelated, I went in with it. But if you sort of need, like if you're doing a squat, your knee hurts, stop doing the squat and do something which is isolate muscles without knee. So it's constantly saying, if it hurts, right, just moving even just that day and the next day.
Yeah.
So it's very important to not trigger something.
Right. And so we can be strategic about that and sort of like train around it, right? But just to kind of say, obviously, these are some of the key variables that some of these folks started to look at. And in relation to what the majority of the studies showed, the majority of the studies showed that obviously the resistance training that the athletes were completing would improve strength, right? So we found like a 10 to 34% improvement in strength across those various studies that he looked at. In addition, 1 to 5K time trial performance, those were like the general distances and that a lot of the studies were looking at. I'd say predominantly that was due to the fact that it's easier to have like your participants run a 1 or a 5K time trial than it is to say, okay, now go and run a 10K. Yeah. And so those were the distances, but you see a 2.7 to 8% improvement there in time trial performance as a result of the strength training. But that's the key right down there at the bottom, running economy. What's very interesting about the resistance training and distance running research is that time and time and time again, it comes back with that change. So it's consistently improving economy. But what's really important to understand is it's not changing VO2 max and it's not changing lactate threshold. And so when I say it's not changing, it's not improving it, but it's not decreasing them. So right away, we're getting improvements in running economy and no decrements in the other key variables that we're all familiar with. VO2 max, lactate threshold. Everybody good so far? Yeah. Very good. Yeah. That's another thing. If you guys do not understand, just raise your hand. So running economy is the oxygen cost of running at a given speed. So we're all familiar with VO2 max, right? So VO2 max is, yeah, I don't mind. So VO2 max is like the maximum amount of oxygen that you can take in and use. And so your high level distance athletes will have higher levels of VO2 max than your sub elite athletes, right? So that means that they're very good at taking in oxygen and using it to fuel exercise. Make sense? Lactate threshold is sort of like that marathon pace. And so it relates to how effective your body is at buffering lactic acid in the muscle, right? And so through training, that shifts to the right. So you actually end up buffering lactate and you're able to sustain higher workloads, yeah, or higher speeds. Running economy then is a variable that relates to the oxygen cost at a given workload. So you can think about this: if we're measuring your oxygen cost while you're running a 10K pace, after your training plan, your oxygen cost is decreased. So you're sustaining the same speed, but you're using less oxygen to do that. So that leaves more energy in the tank later if you need to, or it allows you to work at a higher intensity for, you know, the duration of the race. Does that make sense? And so what we're really saying is we're getting more efficient. Sound good?
The other thing is.
You want that?
These numbers sound a little. 1.78%, what does that mean? Think about how fast you run a 5K. 1%.
Right.
So if you're running 25, what's that? 18. So you're basically just talking. It ends up being vastly, just incredible amounts of time.
Yeah.
Elite runners, if they can get a
0.5%.
increase,
Yeah.
that makes them just incredibly happy. So
Yeah.
50%,
Yeah.
that's just insane amounts.
Yeah. The other thing to mention, just to tag on to Adam's point, is it's important at this point in relation to performance to understand that VO2 max gets you into the elite bracket. VO2 max will not win a race for you because it's your ability to sustain higher workloads. So work at a higher percentage of your VO2 max that helps you improve your performance. Does that make sense? Yeah. VO2 max generally peaks after about 12 weeks of endurance exercise, unless you're doing a lot of interval training. After that, you can push that. You start to hit your genetic limit then after a while. Does that make sense? So it's the other variables, lactate threshold, running economy, that mean you're sustaining higher workloads. That really benefits you. Okay. And looking at Chris's study here, obviously, we're seeing that the majority of the work has been looking at, 25-week strength training durations. But what about going, oh yeah, sorry. Sorry, I'm joking, man. By the way, this is for the ladies in the room. And so this is all of this is to say that all of the changes that we just got in the physiological variables happened with no change in lean body mass. So the athletes were not getting big and bulky, which is another myth that is sort of thrown in. I don't want to strength train because I'll get big and bulky and it'll slow us down. All of the research actually shows that body mass does not change to an appreciable degree. Okay, so sort of interesting to understand that one. This is what I wanted to get to. Chris's intervention study, okay? And so with Chris's intervention study, he looked at like 40 weeks of strength training and how that impacted performance. And so again, he had like 20 runners, 11 runners came into him twice a week across the 40-week period. And the other 9 runners were just the control group athletes. So they were just doing their own thing, right? And again, thinking about some of the variables, they had VO2 max. So we measured VO2 max. He measured a variable called velocity at VO2 max. So many of you have had a VO2 max test done before. Not many. So to give you a sense of how VO2 max is measured, you basically have the athlete running on the treadmill, right? And they're breathing into a tube, and the tube is basically measuring the amount of oxygen that they're using through our at given workloads.
This sucks.
It really sucks. Adam's actually our best performer on there. He was awesome. But generally, it's a graded exercise test that the intensity increases, right? And you're kind of monitoring how oxygen cost is changing as intensity increases. You've got different ways of increasing intensity. Oftentimes, it's increasing the gradient of the treadmill, right? The other way of doing it is increasing speed. And so in order to measure velocity of VO2 max, you need to increase speed. And so it's basically the velocity that would produce VO2 max in you. So at what speed does VO2 max occur? Is that making sense? Yeah. That's also another variable that is found to be very highly correlated with distance running performance. He also measured running economy. He measured additional strength variables. So back squat, 1 rep max. So he was looking at back squat maximum strength and how that changed over time. Counter movement jumps, so CMJ, that's just looking at how high a person jumps. We'll usually use that to evaluate how power is changing over time. And then this other thing called drop jump performance. I'll get into that in a second. But he asked people to basically step off a box and then jump as high as they can. So it's a drop jump. Anybody done a drop jump before? I know you have, Adam. Yeah, a few times. Yeah. And then body composition, because again, we're trying to address that myth about does muscle mass increase? Yes.
So actually one, because I've seen people say that basically one way to actually increase muscle because muscle fibers consuming energy
Yes.
at all times.
Yeah.
Even when you're resting.
Yeah.
So the more muscle you have, the more you're going to be just using energy.
Yeah.
While asleep.
And that will explain his results because he actually saw a decrease of body mass in the athletes. So certainly more in the intervention group than let's say the control group, right? But is everybody following along so far what I'm saying? Yeah. And a couple of key points here. He brought them in right before the training started and tested the physiological variables, the strength variables, as well as body composition. He then brought them in at week 20, so the midpoint, and looked at the same variables, and then he brought them in after the intervention had finished. Okay, so all in all, you're looking at really how is training through preseason and in season sort of affecting some of these variables. We good so far? Awesome. Some of his key findings here: 20% increase in strength by week 20, and that got maintained through week 40. Okay, control group only showed a 5% improvement. You will often see control groups improve in these studies too, just by virtue of the fact that they've previously gone through the strength test and now they're familiar with it. So that's just what we would call like a familiarization change. It's not really a true change, so to speak. It's just they got used to it. They got comfortable with the testing team, the testing environment, all of that sort of thing. Make sense? Okay. The next piece, the velocity of VO2 max that we mentioned a second ago. So that velocity that will produce VO2 max in you increased by 3.5 to 4% across the 40 weeks. So now we're able to sustain higher speeds, okay, before we hit VO2 max. Control group also showed improvements of 1.5 to 2%. They're obviously going through their own running training. That is also going to improve your velocity of VO2 max, right? But adding strength training improved that to a larger degree. Sound good? Great. Then we had running economy, 5% improvement in running economy again. Okay. By week 20, it decreased to 3.5%. By week 40, remember the athletes are in season after around week 40 when he's testing. So that's probably a fatigue effect. So the athletes are like sort of tired because they're racing a lot, right? They're running a lot. And so they're getting that sort of fatigue effect and that decrease. If we look at the control group, again, they're showing improvements, but improvements are much less than the strength training group. So the strength training is really benefiting a lot of these physiological variables that will influence your performance. Good so far? Great. Oh, sorry, yes. They were trained recreational runners, so much like yourselves. Yeah. And a lot of them were pretty good. A lot of them were like, I think, sub 40, sub 35 for 10K. So they were decent runners. Yeah. So sort of interesting, right? So they're really well trained. Data showed a minor decrease in body mass. Going back to Adam's point, right, where as a result of the strength training, all of the training that folks are doing, body mass is actually decreasing. It's not increasing, okay? So you're not getting big and bulky, okay? And there's actually a physiological mechanism behind that, where because strength training, you're doing your strength training at the same time as you're doing your distance running, there's a cancellation effect. We call it the interference effect. So you can't build muscle mass because you're training, let's say, in your lactate threshold zones and above. It actually stunts the change in muscle growth. And so it's physiological mechanism there. One thing I want to look at though is this thing called running economy, right? Because it's happened in a bunch of studies, right? It's shown up. What is that thing? Well, I've kind of said it's the idea of like your submax VO2, you're generally more efficient when running at submax. And so it brings me on to this thing called reactive strength. Has anybody in the room heard of that besides my two students over here in the corner? Has anybody heard reactive strength? No. So it basically relates to how bouncy you are. Okay. And so there is, and if you look at, I was trying to look up good videos of Eliud Kipchoge that I could put up here. Probably the absolute epitome of like a very economical runner. When you see him run, he's just bouncing, right? But there's a test that we can use to evaluate you on this, right? And this is the test, it's a drop jump test. And so what I want you to do is quickly just pay attention to the video. You can see what he's doing, right? He's stepping off the box with his hands on his hips, and he's trying to jump as high as he can. But if you notice, he's being very springy off the floor. Okay, so that's our drop jump test. We use that to measure a metric called reactive strength index. So it's just a fancy way of saying how bouncy are you, okay? And basically it's calculated as the ratio of the height that you jump and the time that you spend in contact with the ground. So if I'm going to be bouncier, am I going to have longer or shorter contact times? Shorter. What's more beneficial for you as a runner? Longer or shorter contact times? Shorter, okay? What we see here is that in addition to the 5% improvement in economy, the athletes got 7% bouncier, right? So they're able to bounce off that floor, okay? By week 20. By week 40, they had almost a 15% improvement in that metric. So that's suggesting to us, and actually we did a quick correlational analysis on data that we gathered on a group of local runners here. And what we actually showed is there's an inverse relationship between reactive strength index and your VO2. So if your reactive strength index is higher, your oxygen cost is lower. Going back to our running economy. Sound good?
And it shows it doesn't apply just to Irish.
It definitely doesn't apply just to Irish runners. Control group, they did show some improvements, but again, that's through their running training. And the addition of the strength training piece is really amplifying that. Yes. That's an awesome question. How many of us have seen Nike Breaking 2? Yeah, sort of. Is it the Nike Vapor Flies? Is that what they're called? They have the carbon plate. Does anyone have them?
Super shoes.
Super shoes. You say. Oh, okay. With the carbon plate in front, and the idea of that is to return the elastic energy. Yeah, same idea. Yeah.
Although my understanding is that recent research has shown carbon plate isn't what's important. It's actually
The midsole.
foam.
Yeah.
Foam.
Yes. That makes perfect sense.
Which is why you see the super shoes have these incredible stacks.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Shows that to people should.
Yeah, I haven't tested that, so I don't know. But like their Nike's slogan at the time was that it will improve your running economy by, was it 3 or 4%? Yeah. So it's definitely going to improve it, but by how much?
So Dave, there's also that example of the Kenyan runners that grew up not wearing shoes.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's sort of like a similar mechanism where maybe what we're seeing with those types of runners through barefoot running is the natural elastic capabilities of your muscles and tendons improve, right? And so they got better return from their Achilles tendon and better return maybe from the plantar ligaments at the bottom of their foot that kind of control the arch height. And so that certainly may be part of it, yeah.
And one thing just to note about super shoes, it's not everyone that makes it the same.
Yeah.
So not even beats necessarily. Some people just don't like the way they feel it. So it's not a lot of people, yes, no question. It's not
Sure. All good? Okay, so in a nutshell, what we're talking about is we want to make you look like a gazelle. That's the idea. Okay, I love this video. It's just that guy bouncing off the ground. It's amazing. And so that then leads us on to thinking a little bit about some of the programming recommendations, right? Because I want to kind of give you folks a sense of like, okay, well, how can you take this information away with you, right? Your programming should address all aspects, and the crew here in Infinity are going to do a great job at that in terms of being very thorough with your training plans. But some of the key things that I like to include within my plans: balance and stability, right? It has an influence on performance and injury. So a lot of the work that I do with my athletes, and Adam can certainly tell you about this, is that I start off every session with a balance exercise of some description. So you might come into our gym and I'm tossing a tennis ball at Adam or something, right? He's having lots of fun with it, okay? But certainly a performance and injury prevention sort of mechanism there. Muscle and tendon tissue tolerance. So one of the important aspects, and I'll talk about this in a sec, is to think about like building up to your heavy strength training, okay? Where we're not jumping straight into heavy loads. We're just kind of getting our body used to performing some of these resistance exercises and getting your muscles and your tendons equipped to handle some other things. Sound good so far? Okay. And maximum strength. And see, this is the thing. A lot of us don't ever go to here if we're runners. Okay. And there was an interesting study done by a group in Europe looking at like Spanish runners, and none of them ever really went there, which is sort of interesting. And so I'm going to talk about that in a sec. Okay. Reactive strength. So think plyometrics. We're all familiar with our plyometric exercises, right? So that should certainly be included within your plan somewhere along the line. Okay. But again, we should progress these. Yes. What's plyometrics? Any exercise that has like a jump to it. So think like vertical jumps, think like jumping forward, think like hopping from one leg to another, or even bouncing. Okay. So those types of things. Say again.
Helps with the bounce.
Helps with the bouncing. I'm going to improve running economy, right? Core muscle function. So thinking about our core training, right? And important to think three-dimensionally. So we're not just doing our front planks. We're also doing our reverse planks. So we're working in the opposite direction. We're also doing our side planks. And don't forget to train rotation. Okay, very important. Because if we think about running, right, we're rotating all of the time. And we need to be able to control that. So that's super important. All right. Now, all of that to say that this is sort of like an interesting meta-analysis study done that sort of looked at programs that really benefited distance runners the most. And it was maximum strength training that benefited them the most. And so what do you think I mean by maximum strength training? And I'll rephrase the question. How many reps would you typically do if you're training maximum strength? Low. Can someone give me a number? 6. So someone said 2. Someone said 6. Yeah, good. So 6 is like your upper limit. Okay, for that. So usually you're lifting loads that will only allow you to do somewhere in the region of 1 to 6 reps if you're truly training maximum strength. Now, I will rarely take those guys to 1s. They're not going to do it, okay? But generally, our sweet spot is like 3 to 6, 4 to 6 reps. So lifting loads that are at that level, okay? Now, we have to understand that we can't get there overnight. We have to build up to that. And that's where your coaches come in terms of like supporting you, guiding you to do that. And I would also say that some of the athletes that I've worked with over the years aren't confident being there. So a big part of that is just getting them confident that they can actually do that. We've one athlete right now who's currently in that, right? She's in like week 2 of that phase for us. And just constantly spotting her and reminding her that, yes, you can do that. You can lift these loads. And that's a big part. It's just getting some confidence in. Make sense so far? Great. Consider adding 2 to 3 resistance training sessions per week. 2 is more than enough, I would say. But if you have extra time in your off season and you want to do some additional, 3 would really help you. Yeah. In season, one is more than enough to maintain the gains. Okay. But it's about being strategic about what you think is your in season, what you think is your off season. Okay.
Let me just slightly. I'm familiar with the exercises. It's possible that
Sure.
I've seen women be much less. On the flip side, I've seen men be too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, when I say it goes both ways. Both
Completely. Yeah. I would say train in phases. And so again, depending on how you're doing this, and so working with your coaches will be ideal for that. But if you're doing this on your own, I'm trying to give you some sense of like how to get started. And so we kind of think about working in 4 to 5 phases. And these first 4 are generally done in the off season. So you're sort of thinking about, okay, what stage of the year do I really want to peak? Like, are there a series of races where I want to like perform at my best, right? And so you're reverse engineering, working backwards, where maybe you're working this in. And you can almost think about these in like 4-week phases, okay? But they don't have to be. And so certainly this first one, it's called local muscular endurance. I will oftentimes have my athletes start here and keep them there for 8 or 12 weeks, depending on who I'm working with. And so first time I worked with Adam, I think you guys were there for about 8 weeks before we moved on, okay? This next one, hypertrophy, it's a fancy way of saying increasing muscle mass, okay? Now remember what I said earlier, you're not going to increase muscle mass because you're running, but the important piece here are the different loads that you're lifting, okay? Because this is higher intensity from the lifting perspective relative to this. And I'm going to give you some guidance for that in a second, okay? The strength work then, that's where we're talking about the 1 to 6 rep piece, but that will come after your hypertrophy, right? Hypertrophy really acts as like a bridge between your muscular endurance piece and these heavy loads that you're going to be lifting. So we're progressing gradually. We're building you up to the high intensity loads that you found out in the previous slide benefit you the most. And why would it benefit you the most? Because you're never there, right? Like our football players, our sprinters, they're there all the time. What we need to do is maybe get a little bit more of this into them, right? But for distance athletes, I mean, your job, right, is running, muscular endurance, right? We're never really here at the strength piece. So you benefit from that a lot. Power, that's where we're talking about maybe starting to include more plyometric exercises, or vertical jumps or long jumps, being bouncy, those types of things, while maintaining your strength. Okay, yes. Great.
So when you go to taper phase, do you also
Yeah, so during taper,
the same way you would taper?
yeah. So during taper, you want to maintain your strength. So your sessions are probably going to be maybe 1 session a week during taper. And during that, you want to only have maybe 40-minute sessions. And with those 40-minute sessions, you're going to have some high loads and a lot of power work. And then any little isolation exercises that you might need as a personal runner to try and stave off your injuries.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second question is, if somebody has a marathon in 8 weeks, do
Yeah.
they start doing this, or do they just finish the marathon and start?
Face the marathon, start afterwards. Yeah. Are you in that situation? Yeah, get through it. I mean, you'll certainly benefit from doing some of the isolation exercises that will help you stave off some of those injuries. But if you're 8 weeks out, I wouldn't start adding in high rep stuff. I wouldn't start adding in like heavy intensity stuff, because you're just going to start getting sore. And now it's going to impact your running. So yeah, off season. Okay. Is this clear so far? Yeah. And so to give you a sense, right, because this is like, obviously that's in season. This is very obscure. And what do we mean by muscular endurance? These ranges give you a sense of where you need to be. So if you're able to do 12 to 15 repetitions of an exercise, that's muscular endurance. Yeah. If you're able to do 6 to 12 reps of an exercise, that's our lean muscle mass hypertrophy zone. Am I making sense? If you're able to do 1 to 6 reps of an exercise, that's your strength zone. Okay. Your power zone, it's 1 to 6 reps, but notice it doesn't have this thing or M after it. When we're training power, we're generally only doing 1 to 6 reps. We're never working to fatigue. Okay. So I'm not doing as many reps as I can of a counter movement jump because that's getting me nothing. Okay. You're doing that while you're running. Okay. So it's not benefiting you. But if I do 1 to 6 reps of a counter movement jump and I'm like, yeah, I've got lots in the tank. I'm just going to hang out here for 2-3 minutes and then I'll do my next set. That's benefiting you the most. When we get to power, we think quality over quantity. Okay, very important. We shouldn't be fatigued there. Okay, so 1 to 6 reps, that's a good sweet spot.
One thing just to note here, as someone who's been doing this for 2 years, I think they would periodically let something slip.
Sprinkle in some knowledge. Yeah.
So, this is getting into the detail that they'll just not really someone who knows what they're doing.
And we're sort of like winding on time. Are we doing okay, Joey?
Sure.
Yeah. And so important to be aware. Lift, and here someone mentioned this earlier about like where do you get started? Where do you put it into like your week? And was it yourself did like the glute work? And it was yourself did the glute work, and then the next day did a speed workout. Not a good idea. I would always say lift on your low volume days. So try to lift on your speed days. Okay. I would run before and then lift after because running is your thing. Okay. Use light and heavy days. And so this is how I like to work with Adam and his crew. Monday, so weekends, you're probably doing your most mileage. Would you agree? That's probably the case for most of you. You're probably racing, even, either training, high volume, weekends, or you're racing weekends. So when folks come into me on Monday, I can't really, I'm exhausted, right? And so in that scenario, I have them lift easier. So how would that look? Well, if we're in a muscular endurance phase on Monday, when they come into me, I will only have them go to 8 to 12 reps, not going higher. But the loads that they're lifting are loads that they can get 15 reps out of, right? So now they get their 12 and they still have a lot left in the tank. I don't care. Stop. You're done. Okay. Because you were racing the weekend. You're running high volume at the weekend. Let's manage that workload. Sound good so far? But Thursday night, that's the night he screams at me the most. I'm like, okay, go to 15s. Unless you're particularly tired, right? In which case, okay, we'll talk about it. We'll dial things back. Makes sense? So then that would be the same if we went to, let's say, a strength phase. So if I'm in a strength phase, they come into me on Monday, they should be lifting loads that they can get 6 reps out of. But on Monday, they're only going to 3 or 4. On Thursday, they're going to 6. Sound good? Okay. So that gives you your light moderate days, yeah? Or light heavy. Yeah.
It's a 15.
No, so it would be, and that's where your coaches would come in terms of like managing that. So usually it's 2 to 3 sets. The way I like to work, it's like 2 sets of every exercise except the squat pattern. I like to overload squats. So I'll have them do 3 sets of squats usually. In muscular endurance, I have dialed that back and had them only do 2, but usually it's 2 sets of everything. Sound good?
And I don't know how they're Dave has this like every set 2 or 3. You'll just alternate that.
Yeah.
And so you're never standing around sitting waiting for you to recover. You just get another exercise which doesn't target quite the same.
Yeah.
So you're taking the most efficient use of the time.
And I have an example program card here. Not, I'm going to give it to you guys, but not from the standpoint of like, your coaches will be the ones that will design that for you. For those of you who choose to sign up, And this is like an example of like, if you're doing this on your own, how might this come together? And it's exactly like Adam said, where maybe you're doing a thing that we call superset, where you do one exercise while you're recovering from that, you do an opposite muscle group or an exercise that's not going to fatigue that original one, and then you just rinse and repeat, right? So we go through things in that order. In terms of exercise selection, this slide deck is full of very interesting pictures, right? This is my own personal philosophy, again, personal experience. I always like to start a session off with some sort of balance exercise. And the reason for that is because it allows us to develop intrinsic foot muscle strength, and it allows us to develop ankle stability. I don't know if any of you folks are trail runners. That's going to be very important to you if you're trail runners. Even if you're not a trail runner and you're running around a track with one leg longer than the other, you'll still benefit from that, right? Because you still need that control around the ankle. Foot core, one of the professors up at IC is like a guru on foot core, and I love that stuff. So what does foot core look like? What we're really talking about here is like trying to improve the intrinsic foot muscle strength. So if I'm standing or sitting, what I'm trying to do is like pull the arch of my foot up by shortening the distance between the ball of my foot and the heel. Does that make sense? So I'll have folks do, Adam coined a toga. I'll have folks do that foot shortening type of exercise to get used to recruiting those muscles. A lot of running injuries come from overpronation. And so the foot core exercises are designed to target that. Does that make sense? And so usually a session that I'm leading will start off with some sort of foot core, will progress to a balance exercise, where maybe you're standing on one leg on a Bosu ball, or you're standing on one leg and you're trying to close your eyes. Anyone ever tried that? It's always fun, right? So you can certainly do that. Your quadriceps strength, that's your bread and butter, right? We really need to get our quads strong. Hamstring strength, that's going to be important. Romanian deadlifts, right? So a lot of us have done that type of hinging exercise, very important. Hamstring curls, very simple way of doing it as well to try and develop hamstring strength. Okay. Moving on from there, glute strength, super important. I can't stress it enough. A lot of running injuries stem from instability. So if we are talking a little bit about, let's say, issues that anybody ever had patella tendonitis, runner's knee, it's often called, or jumper's knee, right? So that can originate from poor intrinsic foot muscle control, poor ankle muscle control, but poor hip strength. And so doing exercises like your glute bridges, anybody ever done clamshells where you're lying on the side of the band? Yeah, everyone loves those. So those are fantastic. Banded walks, where you have a band around maybe your knees or your ankle and you're kind of walking forward or you're going to the side like so. Those are so important for you guys, right? As runners, really important. Calf strength. Adam can speak about calf strength, but there's certainly like, he's probably the strongest person I've ever seen with his calves. You'll see him with a 100-pound dumbbell doing single leg calf raises. Whoa. And so interesting thing about like calves, especially for masters runners. So many masters runners are in the room. Yeah, so there's a few. That muscle group is the muscle group that seems to give you guys the most trouble. Okay, and actually the research shows is it seems to give men more trouble than women. So hey, listen, they're more prone to ACL injuries, so we'll take one for the team. But certainly calf muscle strength, very important to you folks. Okay.
And simultaneously, there's also the impact. So
Yeah.
yes, I have extremely strong calves, but I still have calf shoes, and I've been working on
The plyos.
So
Yeah.
basically get muscles used to the impact.
Yeah. Very important. And then the last thing I'm going to leave you with in relation to the programming piece is core function. I like to call it core function, not core strength. I could get into that, but I'm not going to. But think three-dimensionally. So not just your front and your side planks, also your reverse planks or your glute bridges, right? Also your rotational work. Very important there. And don't forget shoulder strength. Most of us have inactive jobs. Okay, and as a result of those inactive jobs, and I find myself guilty of this, this is my posture throughout the day, right? And so if I'm doing that, then I have that rounded shoulder appearance. I'm lengthening the muscles in the back of my shoulder and shortening the muscles in the front. That actually causes postural issues that can then affect your distance running performance. Because actually a lot of distance runners that I see, maybe because they like to run the trails of Ithaca, they're uphill, they're hunched over a lot, right? And that certainly influences shoulder strength. So getting those shoulders in the back pocket, right? And doing things like banded rows or single arm rows or whatever, fantastic exercises to really try to develop that shoulder strength.
The other big aspect of strength runners is getting your muscles maintain that.
Yeah.
That as you get tired, you're more likely, and certainly, you know, you start hiking going up the hill, all your power goes out.
Yeah.
So stay straight. So you got that.
And so what I'm doing right now is handing you out like an example program of what I've worked through with the folks before. And what I want you to understand is that is not intended to overwrite anything that Infinity are going to do with you. It's for those folks that maybe are trying to get started on their own, and it's a guidance. The different colors are intended to give you a sense of pairings of exercises. Adam talked a little bit about an exercise that we'll do first and then next, and then we'll go back to the first. So the idea is you complete what's in white first, then you move on to green, then you move on to blue, and so on, right? And that helps you get through your program very quickly. And you'll sort of see some of the things that I've been talking about right here, where we're doing single leg balance work, and we're doing RDLs, we're doing our squats, we're doing those kinds of things, right? But like I say, those are the guys that can monitor your technique, give you that feedback program for you around your competition cycle. This is just one example to sort of like, I guess, sprinkle the seed. Now, here's the thing. I spoke to my girlfriend Christy about this last night, and I was like, should I do this for her? And she was like, and so a big part of our discussion here, at least at the start, was I'm strength training for injury. Okay. One of the things I want you to understand is that resistance training, strength training is not a magic pill. In preparation for this session, I'm very clued in with the research in terms of how resistance training affects distance running performance. What I'm less clued in about is what's out there in relation to how it impacts injury, because I always took it for granted. And I understand that strength training has been found to reduce injury risk in things like games-based athletes and all of those sorts of things. And so I thought yesterday, you know what, I'm just going to have a look to see, has anybody actually looked at this? So what are the injury rates in distance runners after strength training plans, or if they're strength training? And so this is sort of what we found. And there's actually two studies that are sort of similar in terms of their outcome. Now I'm going to call out some key points here. 616 participants were surveyed. That's a lot of people, okay? If we look at the difference, it's about 77% female in relation to the total participants. Most runners, so 84.4, had an injury history. Duh, no way, right? 44.6 experienced one in the past year. Okay, so distance running is probably going to, you know, increase injury risk. It does, right? It's one of those things. Common running related injuries included the foot, so about 31%, the knee, 22%, and the other one in there is, sorry, the foot ankle, so 31% there. Running related injury prevalence was higher in runners running more than 19 miles a week. Okay, some key points here. There were no differences based on resistance training participation status. Relatively more running related injuries were observed in runners who trained the hip musculature. So that's sort of interesting, and did not include the upper body. That's why I'm kind of talking about doing those rows, right? Doing some upper body strengthening. So we're targeting the total body. The current study did not determine whether preventative strategies were implemented before or after the injury. So that's right, really like the main limitation of the study. The runners surveyed, we don't understand whether or not they came in and actually started resistance training before they were injured or after they were injured. And most likely they started strength training because they had an injury. And so that sort of suggests to us that it's not a magic pill. It will not cure all of your injuries. Well, what I want to do is draw away some key, or tease out some key points of the study. Firstly, include upper body exercises in your plan. I've said this, right? So we're thinking about a total body plan here. The other thing, injuries will happen. One thing that the study found was that the athletes that experienced the most injuries were the athletes that had a more performance focus. That's not that surprising, because if you're trying to improve your performance, you're working on the edge. You're having to push past that edge. That's what sports performance is about. And injuries happen. Making sense? And then the last point that I'll leave, monitor changes in running volume and intensity. So it's the abrupt increases in volume that are going to cause the injury. Your strength training will not prevent that if you have abrupt increases in volume. So the last point I'll say is communicate with your coaches consistently. Say, hey, coach, I'm trying to increase my volume here because now they can tweak your resistance training to manage the total. Making sense? Sort of interesting that there was another study found something very similar. Okay, it's not a magic pill. Work with your coaches. If I did, I'd take it. And so I'll leave it there. I'm way over time. I'm sorry, but does anyone have any questions at this point? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So people just like see the next.
Sure. Like right now you're meaning, or in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Yeah.
Speaking of magic pills, curious about what you find.
Yeah. For distance runners, it's not directly, but you start adding strength training in it, yeah, and more from like a standpoint, but like creatine influences like the short-term energy system, right? You guys aren't using that quite as much. You're talking
Seconds.
months. Yeah, yeah. So during that initial piece, yeah, yeah, I wouldn't. If you think that you're struggling to recover from your strength training sessions, or you're not certainly better to you to say yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
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 I'll talk. One thing to talk about. There is one magic pill. Seriously, you gotta sleep.
Yeah.
That is the one thing. If you're not getting enough sleep, we'll go down. Yeah. Sorry. That's your own.
All right. And so right now what I'll do is hand over to the folks at Infinity to talk through what they'd like to do with you. And we'll go from there. Okay. Thanks so much.
So I'm good. Let's give everybody just a quick break, just a bathroom break. There's 2 bathrooms down the hallway here. And if you do plan on doing strength training with us, on your sheet on the back, there's instructions on how to create an account. you can just do that now. If you don't need a drink or go to the bathroom, you can just set that up if you plan on doing training. So that way you've already gotten that out of the way, but we'll just resume in just like 2 minutes. Just stand up, stretch a little bit.
Yeah, sitting.
Hopefully it gave some food. The program piece, so it's like these guys to get something. Last night I left and they didn't have our little slides in. I was like, they need to.
Oh, yeah. So you sit. Yeah, things are going well. I said yes. A lot of stuff. Still there. Something interesting. Don't know. You know what it is? Like. Yeah. So it's like, I think 80% of the total things running. There's CrossFit. Much more focused on like big bulking guys.
Yeah.
Much more focused on intense running. So like every exercise has running. So sometimes. Like this. I think you have to like, you know, it's a brand and schmooze. So you gotta do that too, but it's like your gym becomes public service. Yeah, because that's the thing. Things. It's fun, it's a chance to have some music.
All right, we'll just continue.
Oh, good. Sure.
If anyone will go, you
Well, I'm not.
let's check you.
It's a gas level.
And
It'll be something that's, well, you know, it'll be some elements, or- it'll be something like- All right, I'm just gonna continue on for maybe about 10 minutes or so, if that's cool with everybody. So my name is Joey Durgan. I went to Ithaca College for my master's back in 2010 is when I graduated. I did a research study there, and then I decided I liked the area, so I stayed. I worked at Island Health and Fitness for a while as a trainer, worked a lot of other places as a trainer. My training background, I started as more of like an endurance runner. I did cross country, I did some other endurance type events. I've done a lot of Spartan races, things like that, dabbled. I got into strength training because I felt like just as a runner where I was, even smaller than I am now, I felt like I needed to build a little bit of muscle and look more of the part. So I was sort of interested in, the hypertrophy aspect, like the bodybuilding aspect, but that turned into, turning this into a career because I saw all the benefits that strength training has for everybody, regardless of what sport they're into. So I'm 38 now, so I've been doing this for 20 years, which is pretty cool. We've been in business here since 2016, and we've expanded every couple of years. So this is like the newest renovation. So like Jen has been with us before and done strength training in the same capacity that we're going to do with our groups. And I wanted to let everybody know like what a group session feels like, because there's a lot of group sessions in the area. Let's say, a CrossFit program or Orange Theory and so on. So our groups differ a little bit in the sense that they're very small. They're like 4 to 8 people. Sometimes it's just 2 people, and we can have that personalized attention because if Mike is running the class, or maybe Mike and I are both here, maybe I'm working with Jen on something a little bit more specific. She's asking me some more questions. It's not regimented where this is your spot. We're going to do 15 reps of this, 15 reps of that. And I'm just telling you to go and I'm timing you. We're working through the intent behind the movement. So not just form correction, but intention. So when you see someone do something, let's say like a deadlift, I'll demo that with a kettlebell. If I'm doing a sumo deadlift, I can do it in kind of a really relaxed way where I'm safe. I'm not going to harm myself, but am I really like digging my feet into the ground? Am I squeezing my glutes? Am I bracing? What's my breathing like? We help you work through the intention behind that movement by either, if you're not feeling it and the cue isn't working, we'll maybe put a band on the kettlebell and pull it a little bit so it'll force you to actually feel what that overall body tension is that you should be creating. Because we turn core exercises a lot of times into this very specific, okay, we're just holding a plank. Planks are great, but you're using your core when you're doing a back squat even more than you are when you're just holding a plank. And so we want you to be able to turn bench press even into like a full body exercise, because the way that you're bench pressing, you're pushing into the ground, so you're squeezing your glutes, and that'll just translate to just better overall motor control, better overall movement. I want to touch on recovery and supplements and everything. So picking up where Dave left off when we're discussing recovery, sleep, definitely, Adam, is like the magic pill. So if you came in and you were working on something crazy over the night, or you have a kid that's sick and you're trying to train to the same capacity, it's not going to work out as well. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to modify that program a little bit to make it work for you. If you're not feeling it, we can work on more mobility stuff, where we can work on some of those more isolating exercises that are not going to make you feel like a huge stress response and really fatigued. But something else that I found that's really beneficial that has no downside, except, you sweat, is sauna. So if you have access to a sauna, a dry sauna or an infrared saunas are not as hot in the ambient temperature, but they make you sweat a little bit sooner. Dry saunas are really hot air, like the sauna they have at Island. So very hot, like maybe 200, 220 Fahrenheit. They both have the same benefits. Infrared saunas have a little bit less research behind them, but what's really amazing about saunas is that you're doing the same thing that you're doing when you're running. You're actually, through using saunas, you're getting an exercise training type effect, but without the inflammation. So it can actually increase your blood volume, which just means that when you're going out for your run, you're going to have a little bit more oxygen in order to fuel your run. So that's another really amazing, besides sleep, another really great way to speed up recovery and just overall, longevity bias. Doing that sort of thing will really help. With another type of, more important fundamental piece of recovery, of course, is nutrition. So what we like to ask all of our clients is, depending on what intervention you're doing, whether you're doing sauna, you're dabbling and doing higher mileage for this week, or you're doing a strength training program, we want to make sure that you're looking, feeling, and performing better. If you're not doing those three things, then we have to examine what is the missing piece. And I find that with a lot of our athletes that are doing endurance, especially in the realm of ultra stuff, it's usually in the nutrition part that they're lacking. They're just simply not eating enough to fuel their runs. And sometimes, again, like what Dave mentioned about body composition, we have this fear that if we're going to be eating more, okay, now we're going to be gaining some weight and it's going to hurt our run, but really we have to fuel to perform. So some people that do low carb diets, if you're doing a lot of running, that's not a good idea. It's going to really negatively affect sleep and performance. So that's why it takes a trainer or someone that knows what they're doing to help you kind of navigate that, to help you program how you should be changing your nutrition a little bit. But really simple with strength training, it's a good idea to eat a little bit more protein, because you're just getting more building blocks to help you recover from that session. But there is also that misconception that you have to suffer when you train. When you come in, it doesn't have to be a suffer fest. Getting tired isn't necessarily making you better. It's okay that sometimes we're in that realm and we're really working and it's tough. But when we're writing our programming, we don't want a lot of extra reps that aren't going to feed into performance. Does that make sense? So one example would be, let's say I have Mike over here and he's never done strength training before, and he can do 20 push-ups. He's just naturally, pretty strong. If he does 20 push-ups, but the 20th push-up is really low quality and he's burning out, he's probably not going to be able to do much more after that because he's already gone to that failure. So instead, the way I would structure the workout for him would be, maybe he would do 5 reps push-ups, 5 reps bodyweight squats, 4 reps push-ups, 4 reps bodyweight squats, then 3. Then he'd go back around, he'd do 5, 4, 3. He'll be able to do a lot more volume without burning out, with still very high quality reps. He's not going to feel as sore probably from doing that. But when we look at the total number of reps, he's probably doing a lot more doing that style, but recovering in between. So you don't have to dip into like, failure to get those benefits. Of course, sometimes going to muscle failure is okay, and you can get some benefits from doing that. But the way that we're structuring the program here, it's with the mindset that we want to make you better. We're not making you tired when you come in. We're just giving you stuff that's going to improve, running, but also just improve activities of daily living. When you go to move, a piece of furniture, pick something up, you'll feel like you just have a little bit better structure in order to like handle that. So the way that Dave was describing the program is the same way that I'm going to be writing this up. With 2 days a week, that'll be plenty for you to do. The way that we're structuring it is a little bit more on the power side or the strength side on one day, and the other side is a little bit more, like hypertrophy oriented, or rather like, the 8 to 12 rep range. But if you are really experienced with strength training and you're coming in, we will have you do the barbell movements. If you've never done the barbell movement before, we like to get you to like earn your right on the barbell. So make sure that, we know how you're moving and you can move safely before we add that in. And that happens pretty quickly within, a few weeks, like 2 to 4 weeks. You just have to learn that whole process. But, the conception about like going in and starting with, let's say, machines, downside with that is that you're not recruiting a lot of stabilizing muscles. So machines are okay for a more advanced lifter, but machines aren't really great for a beginner lifter because there's that lack of stability. So when someone goes from machines into something that's free weights, it's a more difficult process for them to learn. So as you see, we don't really have machines here except, a lat pull down machine. So the type of training that we're going to be doing is barbell, dumbbell, body weight, and band work. The bands are pretty cool because when you're at your strongest, the bands are at its strongest. So if I hook up a band to the bar and I'm doing like a face pull, as I pull the band is getting a little bit harder, but I'm also at a better mechanical advantage here. So it's called accommodating resistance. It's kind of cool where normally just on a machine, it's always the same weight, but when we're using bands, which we implement to a lot of our exercises, they're getting stronger when you're at your strongest point in the lift. So even if you're experienced with lifting, and you've done barbell and dumbbell work, if you haven't used bands before, you may see some noticeable differences when we incorporate those different types of training. Another aspect of recovery I wanted to mention, because I know it's a really big thing, vitamin I, ibuprofen. So I wanted to mention that you should be really cautious of that, because I'm talking about structuring our program where we're doing just enough, not too much, right? So when you're doing your runs or when you're lifting, you want your body to go through the inflammatory process. You don't want too much inflammation, but you want enough to where you can recover. That process is called hormesis. So if you use high dose vitamin C or ibuprofen, these NSAIDs, that can really limit your ability to adapt to the exercise. So if you use ibuprofen a lot, just be aware that it could be negating some of the work that you're doing if you're trying to improve. Also, when I was a runner, I had a stress fracture. If you're coming back from a stress fracture or something and you're still using ibuprofen, it can negatively affect bone remodeling. So your bone is not going to build up as strong as it would if you weren't using the NSAID. So it's just, I wanted to throw that out there because a lot of runners go through, get through stress fractures, they return back to running, but it's good to be aware of those types of things. Personally, I've had many coaches. I have a jiu-jitsu coach now, so does Dave. Dave and I do that together. I've had a Muay Thai coach, an Olympic lifting coach, and just a regular strength coach. And it was super, it was really crucial for me because I was getting stuck in just doing what I was familiar with. So some of the bro stuff, the bro workouts, I was doing a lot of pull-ups and bench press, but I was like, oh, I won't do squats today because I just don't feel like it, So it really helps to have a coach program that stuff for you because you really won't do it on your own unless you are, I mean, just like an incredible, like motivated person that just does things. Like, I mean, I don't, and I'm pretty motivated and I stick to things, but it helps to have a program that you're doing things off of. And so I write my own programs sometimes, or I'll do another trainer's program. So in the gym, usually the 3 coaches will take turns writing the programming. So that way, you're not just getting that one coach's perspective. The program might incorporate in some movements that you've never thought of before as a coach. So you're experiencing here with a small group. We'll start off with basically just some mobility and some stretching. We'll get warm. We'll do some central nervous system type stuff which could be like pogo hops, some line drills, some movement based stuff, some med ball slams, and then we'll basically get into the strength training component. I think that you'll find that if you haven't done strength training before, that it's really reasonable. You know, each person is going to be doing it at a different intensity level, but we're going to push you to where you'll be getting better, and we'll be adjusting the weights as we can tell that you can handle more. Because my mom just recently started to do strength training, and I say that you know, with this because when she came into the gym and I had her join one of my classes, so her strength training was that you just have like 5-pound weights. But I know that with those 5-pound weights, she could do a chest press 30 or 40 or even 50 times. That's not really strength training the way that we want her to, you know, it's not going to elicit an adaptation. So if you think like, okay, Dave said 8 to 12, and you get to the 12th rep, you know, it's like, okay, you have to ask yourself, could I do 20 reps of this weight? And it really helps to have somebody that can notice how you're lifting and if you're struggling or not, to adjust that. If you're using the Train Heroic app, which is the other way that you can work with us instead of in person, the Train Heroic app will allow you to input the weights that you're using. So that way it'll suggest another weight for you to use on the same exercise the following week. And that way it'll keep track of your lifts that you want to keep track of if they're not, you know, body weight oriented. So that's a really useful tool to be able to chip away at getting better and not just falling into that state of, okay, you have that initial neuromuscular adaptation, but now what? You know, like, where do I go from here now that you're familiarized with this stuff? So you can ask me any questions about the app or about training here. We'll help you navigate that, but I want you to understand that you could be at any level. Even someone that's injured has like an active, you know, knee or shoulder injury, and that's sort of like one thing that we specialize in. We will find a way to design your program so it'll work for you and it'll make you better instead of just making you tired. Any questions? Question? Right. So originally I was thinking if you can make the 5 p.m., the 5 p.m. is the lowest attended class. So that would be typically what we have, like maybe 2 or 3 people in 5 p.m. So if you want to go for like the lower attended classes, the 5 p.m. will be your best bet. If you can't make that time, then if let's say 4 of you wanted to do, let's say, a 6 p.m. time, we could maybe create a class if the evening is the only class time that you have. The morning times, typically I teach all of the mornings. So 7 a.m., 8 a.m., and 10 a.m., Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 a.m. Thursday, and then Tuesday at 10 a.m. You can do those. If you come into those, I'm going to be doing, you know, my program with some of the general clients that we have. There could be a class of, you know, 4 to 6 people. But I'm going to have you do the runners program that I wrote. So even though that class has people doing something else in it, you can still do your program in that class because I have the program and I'm gonna work off of that. Does that make sense?
We'll do the runners.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what class you do, we'll implement that. And then because we're all basing off the same program, like Kim and Mike are not writing their own programs, I'm writing the program. And we're all communicating about how your session went. And when it's appropriate, you know, we're logging like relevant information. Let's say if it's on like a squat or something, and we want to know our numbers so we can keep working to like progressively overload so we don't stagnate. No, so we have the boxing ring, but we only have 3 boxing classes. So really fundamentally, we're a strength and conditioning gym that has boxing as like a fun thing to do on the side. So like we do kids boxing. Mike is the instructor for that Tuesday and Thursday. And if you have any, you know, any kids that are interested in doing boxing, it's a fun class that's no contact. And the cool thing about that is we put it at 5 p.m. so the parent could do the strength training group at the same time instead of just sitting there. So you could have your kid do boxing while you're doing strength training.
What's that?
So originally it was like 10 to 14, but I've since opened it up to like younger kids. Like my son is 7, and I know another family is going to start bringing their 7-year-old, so we can work with, you know, young kids too. But I would say 7 would be like the youngest probably that we should work with. But right now we have also low numbers in that class, like just a couple kids class next.
I see the start date says 3.
They start on Monday.
Yeah, so if it starts.
That's okay. So we'll do like a rolling start if you want to just get started the following week. You know, I'm gonna have the same programming. The way that I'll do the programming is day 1 and day 2. They're both gonna be like full body oriented, but with one of them being like more hip dominant and the other being more quad dominant movement. So quad dominant movement would be like squat, hip dominant movement would be more like the deadlift. But they'll go basically day 1, day 2 for next week will be the same as the following week. That way you're getting a couple exposures to those same exercises, because we want variety in our workouts, but we don't want so much variety that you can't get any adaptation to the movements. So if I'm trying to teach you bench press and I have you do the bar once and then you do dumbbell press the next week, and the following week you're just doing push-ups or an overhead press, like you want some predictability in the programming to adapt to it, but not adapt in a way where you're stagnating.
Say we got a injury, like the guy trying to strain knee.
We
Think about this.
we'll communicate about that. It's okay to get started. We're not going to take you into pain or do anything that's causing pain. So your program might look a little different, like we'll be more rehabilitation, you know, oriented. So the exercises that we're going to do are going to be like, you know, we'll attack the ankle, we'll do like calf raises, tib raises, we'll do some like banded hip hinging for like stability, but we're not going to be doing, you know, like squats and things like that necessarily if that's causing you pain. So if you're coming in, let's say Monday, you describe that issue, you know, we might, if it's just, you know, like general pain, we'll stay out of pain and we'll change some of the exercise selection to where it's like safe, but you're still gonna be able to, you know, get a good response from it. Any other questions? Yeah. The way that I set it up, it's discounted about 30%. So it's $20 session. If you look at it on a per session basis. It's $160 for 8 sessions. If you planned on, I want you to try to do 2 days a week, but let's say I have a trip. You can just keep those credits and use them for the next month. Meaning, let's say I only use 6 of my credits for the class. In March, I can use the other 2 in April, and it can just be like kind of a rolling system where it'll go into the next month. But I do want you to try to do 2 days a week because you'll see a lot more benefits than just doing 1. But if you can only manage 1, or you're doing 1 with the intent of working out on your own the other day, then that's okay. And a lot of stuff that you'll learn in here, you'll be able to apply to your own workout, where you can, take the coaching cues that we're using, and you can then do it on your own, whether it's at home or in a gym. Like, we want you to be able to feel like we want to advise you, but we want you to feel like you can also work out without, hurting yourself, obviously. With Train Heroic, what we do is we put your email address like on our system, and then you'll open the app. It'll show you day 1, day 2, and you'll click on an exercise. It'll show how to do that exercise with the YouTube video, and then it'll allow you to input, numbers in there, like how many reps you did or what weight you did. So we just need to know that you want to do that, and that we'll set up basically like an option on our billing software. So you just are going to be on like a monthly $30 subscription, basically, unless you tell us to cancel it. So all I need is an email address, and then payment is put on your account, and then we can set it up.
And
It's going to be the program that I write for people here. So it won't be personalized to the level that it's for you, but it's for like runners. So it's for runners, but it's not taking into account, let's say, if you have a specific injury. And it also is not going to know what your training history is. But part of that is like, if you don't have any training history, like, have you done training before?
Well,
Okay. So you'll have to recognize if there's something on there that you're not familiar with. You'll have to either ask us or understand what a regression of that exercise is going to be. So if it's a barbell back squat, a regression, an immediate regression would be like a kettlebell squat, or just a body weight squat. So it's better if you're either really familiarized with strength training to use the app. It's not as good if you're at a beginner level, because again, I'm not going to be able to coach you on those movements, but it is a useful tool if you plan on using that in conjunction with training in here with us. Because training with us a little bit, you'll be able to work through some of those movement issues that anybody could have. Like, someone could be doing a squat, and it looks like great, but I'm overarching my back when I do it. You wouldn't necessarily know that if no one's ever watching. But hopefully, if you're training with us a little bit, we can clean those things up, and you'll have more fundamental, like, good movement patterns, like doing a squat, doing a hip hinge, that sort of thing. And with things like CrossFit, Orange Theory, those types of like activities, like, so CrossFit, specifically, by doing CrossFit, you're getting better at CrossFit. It's not necessarily making you better at other things. I've coached it before, and I've done it before, and it can definitely be like really beneficial, but I find that it's not specific enough. It doesn't take, it's too glycolytic, meaning it's too much in like the high intensity realm, and there's a lot of reps that if you're doing it in like a 20-minute AMRAP, quality of your form can go down, and there's also some things that are unnecessary for like a training adaptation for like a runner, or anyone. Like doing Olympic lifting with like high reps doesn't really elicit any sort of training response, except making you better at doing Olympic lifting at a low weight for the sport. So we want to have that programming mindset where what we're doing is making you a better runner. And at least it's not hurting you, like for sure. But it, we want to make you better. We don't want it to just be something that you're doing that's, like Dave was saying, it's just the idea of injury prevention. It's to make you a better runner, like improving running economy. And also like strength training is massively beneficial for lots of other reasons too. But even mental health, which is big, which I know a lot of you probably run for mental health. Like that's a big benefit. Any other questions? So if you have any questions for me about how to sign up on the app, I have the instructions there. If you have any issues, let me know. If you want to do Train Heroic, I can put your email address down and then give you instructions from there. But you're free to go now. I could talk all day about this. I would like it. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible.
Thank you very much, Joey.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dave.